Okay, class, this week, week 9, we're covering wildlife documentaries. So let's jump into it. I want to discuss the main readings that we're covering this week. And there are 4 dominant themes, and we'll go over each one in detail in a minute. So let me just highlight what they are. First, we have the relationship between camera and animals. Then the idea of action and adventure as entertainment, which is an important aspect of wildlife movies. We also want to look at the anthropocentrism that are used to interpret animal behaviors and relationships, but also how animals can be used to communicate certain positive themes and how to highlight issues around climate change. So in order for us to look at the current moment, we should go into the past. And one thing that you guys probably have not been exposed to is a certain type of wildlife documentary that I grew up watching. I have some images here of some types of films and TV shows that were quite common when I was a kid. First, you have the Walt Disney wildlife documentaries, but then you also have these TV shows, in particular, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. Let me move this down so you can see that. And when I was a little kid, there was Marlin Perkins, who's this gentleman here, and then later on when he retired, Jim Fowler. And they sort of set a particular archetype for these kind of films. And one thing, a general theme that we can explore is how these films do a particular kind of ideological work. So what is ideological work? It's how films or TV or any kind of media normalize certain beliefs, how they normalize certain ideologies so that they are taken for granted. For example, one thing that comes out of this, the origins of wildlife documentaries, is this concept of scientific authority. So you always have this male disembodied voice who's talking about what we're looking at. They're giving us scientific information, scientific thought, and it's a way to sort of assert a kind of scientific control over the environment. Another legacy is the promoting of nationalistic exploration, which we'll get into in a bit, so I won't comment further at the moment. The next point is the normative views of family that these kind of films promote. So in the 1950s, for example, the concept of the nuclear family was then imposed upon how we looked at animals, and they sort of reinforced certain ideologies about how people should behave in the home. I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. And last but not least, environmental concerns. So, there is an aspect of these documentaries that are grounded in a concern and a care for the environment. So let's not lose sight of that. Okay, so here's a more recent case study, African cats. So if you want, you can pause this video, and down below I have put a link to the trailer for this film, and right click on it and open it in a new tab so you don't lose where you are in this video. Take a look at that trailer and then come back. So go ahead and take this moment to pause. Pause, okay. Okay, welcome back. So, in this example, a couple of points I want to make. Let's move this video over here because I want to read this thing to you. So first of all, the strategy of the filmmaker, this is a Disney film, we'll talk more about Disney later in this talk, is to make connections with animals through appeals to a shared planet, so we're all part of the same planet, normalizing family values and motherhood. So you'll see this use of depicting the animals as like a family, as motherhood, as sort of relationship between child and mother. I think the strategy is so that we can relate to that in terms of our own socializations in our society. I want to read to you this quote up here. This is a description of the film from the African Cats website. So it reads, an epic true story set against the backdrop of one of the wildest places on earth. African cats captures real-life love, humor, and determination of the majestic kings of the savannah. Narrated by Samuel L. Jackson, the story features Mara, an endearing lion cub who strives to grow up with her mother's strength, spirit, and wisdom, Sita, a fearless cheetah and single mother of 5 mischievous newborns, and Fang, a proud leader of the pride who must defend his family from a rival lion and his sons. So as you can see, the whole documentary is framed as a story about a family, like could be our family, and that you have mothers, you have fathers, you have single mothers, you have children, etc., etc. So this is a fairly common tactic in these kind of movies. Moving on. So one thing we need to consider is what is actually real in a wildlife film. So again, pause because I have a link right below, right below here. Wild tiger cub shot for the first time, David Attenborough. Once you pause here, watch it. It's about, you don't have to watch the full thing, but let's say 3 or 4 minutes, and then come back. Okay, ready, pause. Okay, welcome back. So, that's a good example we can use to sort of see the techniques that are used to place us in the scene. So what kind of techniques are those? Well, they're very common techniques for like reality television or for documentary filmmaking. So there's kind of like this jerky camera movement, which is common to the cinema verite style. Makes us feel like we're there. And obviously humans are not present, so we're kind of peering in and sneaking in there. But it's deceptive because it's very much a constructed scene. There's all kinds of edits back and forth, the kind of edits you would see in a Hollywood film, as if someone is looking, there's an edit cut to an elephant, as if the elephant is watching the scene. There's a cut to some other tigers, as if they're watching. So these kind of back and forth techniques sort of give us the impression that this reality is seamless, but it's not. You're taking all these different footage from different times. They're cutting out all the boring stuff. They're just showing us the most interesting things. So we have to be aware of that. What we're watching is always a very limited view of what's actually has been captured on tape or camera, as the case may be. Okay, so important to think about is the way that wildlife documentaries blur the line between fiction, factuality, and television. So common characteristics are, first of all, I mentioned to you this didactic, paternalistic, disembodied male narrator who's very common. I put a picture here of David Attenborough, who's one of the most famous current narrators of wildlife films. You probably, if you've seen Planet Earth, will recognize him. He's omniscient, he's all-powerful, he has some kind of, authority over what we're seeing, and so we take that for granted when we watch these. There's all kinds of associations with knowledge claims and scientific authority. So we don't see any visible scientists, yet we assume that the narrator has the authority and the knowledge of science supporting whatever it is he, usually it's a man, is saying. And also it situates the viewer as an observer and not an interpreter, as if we're in some kind of objective lab experiment. As if we can see it, we can know it. So I think that's kind of interesting, that it assumes this kind of anthropocentric gaze upon the environment that makes us all knowing and all seeing and all knowledgeable just because we can capture it on camera. Okay, and then looks like we lost some of the text here. Let me move this up. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So these kind of films produce a decontextualized natural sublime, quite often without humans, as if humans are not interfering or are not present in the reality of these animals. But in fact, the human is there. I mean, the human is there with the camera, but we're somehow made to forget that. The documentaries erase the presence of the human or the camera, or makes it seem natural at least. Another interesting point, which is that it sets nature apart from human activity as if it's timeless, that it's self-contained, that it's self-regulated outside of history, that it's beyond our time, that it somehow exists in its own time, which we know is actually not true. I mean, we all live on the same planet, and all of our behaviors and actions are really impacting all animals, no matter where they are, even if they're isolated from us. But the ideological work that these films do is to somehow place nature, or these nature environments, this wilderness, as if it's outside of time, that it's somehow beyond history, that it exists in its own parallel reality. But we can't forget that this is entertainment-driven cinema, so it's entertainment, but it's also a simulation, that it's a constructed reality, and we can't lose sight of that. But the way that these are edited and put together, they try to create the illusion that somehow these are, in fact, some kind of objective reality that we're watching. But they have to do it in a way that's entertaining, that attracts us, because it's a commodity. They want us to buy the ticket, they want us to view it, they want us to go see whether the film is in the cinema or on a streaming platform, but they need to attract our attention to keep us interested. Okay, close-ups, speed it up. Okay, so these are some of the techniques that make them more like blockbuster films. They have these close-ups, they speed up action, they show us the exciting moments, they cut out all the boring parts. I mean, you can imagine them sitting with the camera there for days and days to capture that one shot. We don't see those hours and hours of boredom where nothing is going on. And remember that it is these films are competing in an attention economy. They have to compete with all this other stuff that's around people, reality TV, I mean, you name it. Okay? So, I want to return to this point about historical precedents of exploration and adventure. So, films and photography have always been used to sort of justify the glory of the nation, whether it's exploration to the North Pole, the South Pole. I put some historical images here. You see the explorers carrying the flags. Those explorations are always a way of glorifying the state and how great, the nation is, and their scientific acumen and ability to go out and conquer the world. And film and photography always has had that role in justifying and providing evidence of this sort of national conquest of the wild. And often it's done in this way of sort of man against the primitive state, like the civilized man going out into the uncivilized, into the primal, and being able to conquer that. There's a little bit of that also in the way people talk about climbing mountains, or like Mount Everest. So, in this genre that we've sort of inherited historically, you can see that the kind of things that you commonly will see in these depictions are the dramas of a particular location, extreme weather, things like that. The vagaries of adventure, such as arrival, struggles, the technologies that allow people to survive in an environment that humans can't really normally survive in, and to take us to see things that we would never see, which actually is true. So there's, some element of truth that these films will allow us to go places that we normally would never go to. Another point I want to raise, as I mentioned at the beginning, that wildlife films are important in terms of educating about the climate. Part of the problem with communicating climate change is that the climate change is not mediagenic. It's actually an abstraction. It's something that's happening, in the future. Obviously, there's stuff going on now, but how do you represent something that's happening slowly, not in human time scale? And that's something that, filmmakers have to try to do when they're going out and capturing, let's say, quite typically, a polar bear who's stranded out on a ice float, trying to swim, starving, things like that. So, what about, are we showing animals, but not saving them? Are they just there for our entertainment? That's something to consider. And whether or not wildlife films, this is the last bullet point here, whether wildlife films, can they actually motivate responsible environmental politics? In other words, do they just give us something to watch, a spectacle to consume and enjoy, and by watching it somehow we feel like we've done something about it? Or can it actually motivate us to take action? Okay, let's go on. Another important point that comes out of the readings, we talked about companion species when we talked in previous weeks about ecofeminist ethics. Let's return for a minute to talk about this one particular theme which I thought was really interesting, the idea of the speciesist camera, which is related to the environmental gaze that we talked about when we talked about Into the Wild and Leave No Trace and those kind of films where the camera consumes the environment for human consumption, sort of objectifies the environment. Well, there's also this argument that this is done to animals as well. So non-human animals become objects to be looked at. They are objects for our enjoyment, for our gaze, like we've talked about in past about the female gaze, for example. So quite often, as discussed in the readings and some of the examples I raised, animals are objectified and anthropomorphized in terms of how we relate to them, like a human family, mother, father, child, things like that. And then there was this funny quote about, like turning animals into caricatures, that penguins are just little children with tuxedos and they're just funny things for us to laugh at and enjoy for our pleasure. But does the camera actually bring us closer to them? Do we identify with them? Do we have empathy for them? Or is it just there for our consumption? So there's an argument that there needs to be an effort to decenter the speciesist gaze. How do we decenter it? Well, we can see, one, put animals and humans in the same cinematic space, so they're cohabiting, as opposed to separating animals from humans, which is quite common. Allow non-human animals to watch back. Let the animals gaze at us. And also to minimize or destabilize human language, the language that we use to describe animals. Maybe we can just watch them without language. Is that possible? Would we be entertained? Would we enjoy it? And then I thought this was kind of interesting, this idea of zoomorphic footage and commentary that can remind humans of our own animality. So in other words, Batman is zoomorphic. He's a Batman, or Avatar, which I put the pictures here on the slide, where there's these hybrid alien human animal creatures to sort of remind us that we are animals too. I think maybe we lose sight of the fact that we think we're not animals, but that's actually, as you know, silly. We are completely and totally animals. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm going to go to part 2 in a minute to talk about Disney, which I think is a very important theme. So let's take a break, take a deep breath, piano, piano. I hope you're well. I will be back with part 2 in a minute.